Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Glenn Diesen and I'm joined today by Alexander Mercouris and Alastair Crooke, very famous, well-known top British as well as EU diplomats. The topic today is, more or less if war is unavoidable, based on an article written by Alastair Crooke. So this, of course, focused mainly then on Israel's war now also with Hezbollah and the possibility of or the prospect of unavoidable war with Iran. But in terms of the whole idea of war becoming unavoidable, one could always extend this towards Russia as well. Because I guess what was unique there was for years and years we seemed to reject all possible peaceful solution or peace agreements, and meanwhile pushing towards war becoming the only solution. Now, but again, we really wanted to focus on the Middle East first, but perhaps we could begin with this article you wrote, because I found that to be very fascinating. You wrote more or less the world being the image of the world being pushed as being either liberal democracy or all these bad actors, which is seemingly in cahoots. And I guess the main problem is if you see your adversary as being pure evil, only bad intentions, no legitimate security interests, it's very easy to end up in a situation where war becomes the sole way of solving this problem. But again, I was hoping you could elaborate a bit on this article, especially this concept of the
whole of society.
Society, yeah, I found that to be fascinating because it reminded me a bit about totalitarianism, when politics intrude in all aspects of public and private life, when even civil society, NGO, media, corporations. Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, yes. I mean, what it reflects is a sort of a change in politics, particularly in the United States, but also in parts of Europe, like Britain, I think, came in with the Obama period, when what we saw was a shift away towards politics being determined by the professionals in the back room of Chicago initially, but in the back room, with the professionals and with the big mega donors are now sort of the directors, the orchestrators of politics. And Hollywood plays a big part in this. They set the memes, they set the ideas. And what is striking is that two things I would say out of this recent period, because I mean, it has been brought home to us so clearly by the sort of the coup d'etat mounted against a sitting president who was just removed by the control the control room, the back room, and then replaced by someone who hasn't secured a vote by anyone at any time, certainly not in 2020 or lately, and then just suddenly in a big rally turns around and announces, "Hey everyone, just to tell you, I am now the Democratic presidential candidate." We all look around and say, "Really? Was there an election or something? Did I miss something?" I mean, suddenly she announces she is the candidate. Now, let's leave that for a moment and say, the two things that strike you from this whole episode is that actually presidents don't seem to matter so much. I mean, they can be removed. A new one can be manufactured by mainstream media acting as a whole, and then it comes in and a new presidential figurehead suddenly appears, and then there is a huge acclaim, and by claim more than by vote becomes the presidential candidate. All implies that actually, in the relative weighting compared with the backroom control, the front room of the presidency clearly doesn't matter so much in this new thing. And also, perhaps also, people are not, the voters don't really matter so much. And I think that's the other thing that is quite striking about this new politics, before I get on to the whole of society, is this new politics that we're encountering is basically a politics which is about memes and about Hollywood. It's about emoting rather than arguing. There's no debate about policies or foreign policies. It's, this is going to be a campaign of joy. Republicans are weird. I mean, these things don't have any sort of substance. They're helping people emote and sort of come together. And what is the purpose of all this? The purpose of all this is to get an ideological alignment. Ideological in the loosest sense, because it's not really thought out in an ideological way. It's really a sort of almost moving towards a cult. I mean, you just got to take it on faith and you just follow this. And what happened really sort of with Obama time and the war on terror was the sense that this had to be whole of society, that, that extremists had to be monitored. And so we had Homeland Security and we have, the the security state being brought into it, the intelligence services, Department of Justice, and then, of course, the tech platforms, monitoring and checking people's views and their ideas and what they're thinking, in order to stop what? Well, no longer terrorism, but to stop what they say dangerous extremists that threaten our democracy, extremists that threaten our values, our consensus, undefined, but, again, an emotive use of the word. And so they come in and we have whole of society really pursuing, if you like, a totalizing approach, a totalizing politics of alignment on, whatever it is, this campaign of joy and of, of our democracy against these radical and dangerous, if you like, extremists. But this totalizing in the domestic sphere also feeds across into the foreign policy sphere, because then not only, and then everyone else becomes an extremist. Putin is an extremist. Iranian mullahs, as they call them. There are no mullahs in Iran, but Iranian mullahs become extremists. China is an extremist in a different way. And they also coalesce into being, if you like, something that is opposed and against our values, our alignment. They are the extremists. In a way, it's a sort of substitute for the Cold War, when you had a sort of dialectical opposition between, Western capitalism and communism, and now that's all gone and gone away. So we have the new dialectical sort of opposition between all of society, the whole of society sort of consensus on the one hand, not permitting any ideological non-alignment. The banks, closing down people's accounts because you don't share our values. I mean, your account, so sorry, sir, your account has to be closed because you don't share our values. You recall that happened to Mr. Farage in the UK, whatever his values were. And so you get, if you like, foreign policy sort of coalesces into a single enemy, a single, if you like, extremist that threatens our democracy, our values, our consensus. And so you don't any longer do what I've always complained about. There's no longer any ability to discriminate, to be able to understand that Iran is not like Russia, and Russia is not China, and that these are quite if you like, distinct and separate entities, and that they're not just simply subsumed. And I saw this long ago when everything got subsumed into political Islam. And I remember arguing in Washington long ago then and saying, but you have to actually discriminate, and you have to understand that there are some parts of the spectrum that are highly dangerous to other Muslims as well as to themselves, and there are other parts of the spectrum that actually bring their communities something that is of value to them. People like Ahmad Shah Massoud, if you like, as opposed to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, on the dangerous end of this process. Anyway, no one wanted to hear that. It was, Islam is a danger. And they used it as a form of identity politics. Anyway, so what I was saying really from all of this is that inevitably then as we move and Iran reacts, if you like, to the assassination of Hania, then it is quite likely that this will sort of move and will embrace Russia, because Russia is an extremist that is helping Iran. It is providing it with defense mechanism, rather as Russia has been, if you like, a dangerous actor in Ukraine, and China is an extremist that has been providing sort of material support to Russia to fight in Ukraine. So with this coalescing into one, this is one aspect of it. The second aspect of it really is that as I look at how this riposte by Iran plays out, it seems to me, I wouldn't say it's impossible to stop escalation, but I would say it's going to be extremely difficult. Let me just explain a little bit why, because I think the reason it's taking a little time to sort out is not the sort of nonsense that the Telegraph keeps reporting, but is because the first part of it, landing a blow on Israel that makes them regret, and which the Iranians understand has to be, painful, because when they did their 13th of April message, which was a message rather than an attack, it obviously was a mistake. It didn't work. And then just after that, we got the obvious provocation by Netanyahu of killing Hania in Tehran and during the inauguration of a new president, deliberately. I mean, a smack in the face of Iran. So the 13th of April didn't stop that. So it's got to be something that is strong enough to stop, a few months later, Netanyahu doing another provocation and starting to start a war. And he made it very clear that this is the aim, because he went to Washington and he spoke to the Congress, the joint houses of Congress, and he laid it out. We need a war against Iran and all its allies. This is civilization against barbarism, and America has to assist in this war. And it's a civilizational war. He gets back here and he immediately provokes it. So the first stage that Iran will be doing, and it's a complex one, I think, but out of what I saw from the 13th of April, Iran has the ability, if you carefully manage the waves of attack and the flight times of missiles and the type of missiles, to use it in a careful way. For example, if you use the first wave of expendable drones, the American aircraft can't avoid, if you like, attacking the drones, because although their warhead is tiny, it's still a warhead. But if you do the timing between the drones so that the American aircraft don't have time to refuel, they won't be there for the second wave. And the second wave can be adjusted, that you send them chasing all after cruise missiles, And then the third wave will be ballistic missiles or something that's coming down. And at the same time, you'll have a wave coming in from Hamas, Hezbollah, in Lebanon, which may be, again, which will only take a few minutes to arrive. I mean, a cruise missile from Iran, or if they place it in Iraq, can arrive in a few minutes. On the 13th of April, they started off with the drones and gave Israel 4 hours notice to get their planes up and positioned and everything. Now they can do the opposite, is that they can play, if you like, the Americans against the short-term timings and not allow the aircraft, because they were nearly all shot down by Sidewinder missiles. The Israelis didn't use very much, if at all, their own air defense systems. So, the first stage may land quite a heavy blow on Israel, on its military elements. Then the question is, what does Netanyahu do? He wants an all-out war with America participating. So there has to be a new provocation, a bigger provocation. What is that going to be? And then what is the Iranian defense to that answer, which is one of the things that I think is being discussed with Russia at some length, and we're seeing electronic warfare and radar systems and missiles and things being supplied to Iran at this time. But all of that's why I think it's taken some time. You've got to, all of this is complicated enough just for Iran, but they're playing off with 4 different actors, with Ansar Allah and Hezbollah, and also the Hashad in the PMU in Iraq. So I think this. How do we then stop it becoming a war? That was the question that I posed. Is it inevitable? Probably not quite inevitable, but I don't see very easily that it's escalating in Syria. It's escalating, of course, in Lebanon and across the West Bank. The provocations are going on in terms of the Temple Mount and in Lebanon. I mean, clearly, Netanyahu and that sector of the government want a big war. Question is, does America want it? And the answer is that you don't ask people like Kamala Harris or Waltz whether they want a war at this stage, because they're just the figureheads anyway. But I mean, obviously they don't, because they don't have the foreign policy expertise. And if the war breaks out, everyone will be saying, well, look, we need a safe pair of hands here. We don't want someone who's got no knowledge of the Middle East, or etc. But there are sort of deeper, what I call these sort of weight-bearing structures of the deep state that cannot allow, if you like, the brittle branch on which the whole of Western foreign policy hangs to break off and crash. Because these, if you like, load-bearing structures have been there for a long time and are virtually immutable. From Wolfowitz, Bush doctrine that no competitor can be allowed to emerge, the military edge for Israel, the need to have a bipartisan policy on Israel in Congress. All these things are what I call these load-bearing structures, because the whole of Middle East policy hangs on that critical edge, the crucial critical edge for Israeli military edge. I mean, so much, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya, all of these things flow out of these sort of, if you like, load-bearing structures within foreign policy. So, they're not going to allow, even if she felt like it, Kamala Harris to destroy bipartisanship on the Israeli issue. it's too much a key, one of these profound elements of it. So whatever she thinks will be overridden by the sort of the deep needs to maintain, if you like, that brittle branch from which all foreign policy, American policy, and of course I include in that financial policy, and the fact that I saw you had Mr. Armstrong on recently, and he talked about debt, but he missed saying, the crucial part, in my view, which is that the whole of the West has a sort of inverted pyramid of fiat currency, of options, and of what do you call these bigger things, derivatives, huge trillions of, and what's at the base of this inverted pyramid, there is no collateral, no real security. There may be a few bars of gold here and there or something like that, but there's no collateral on which all these claims and all these ephemeral products hang. They are without actually any sort of collateral, so that if they start collapsing, everyone's going to say, yeah, but where's something solid? Where's something of value? Where's the value that we can have? If it's all collapsing, all these derivatives are moving in a single direction, I want value. I want something. I want at least, 50% of my money back where I get it, and you can't get it. And so that's why you get people, I think, like Lindsey Graham saying, look, Ukraine has rare materials, has rare energy, coal and things worth $12 trillion. We can't let that slip. We can't let it go to Putin. They need it to reliquefy this great inverted pyramid of fiat nothingness. So this is the reset, in a sense. I mean, he started off down that path, but I'm just taking it into the world of geopolitics and conflict, if you like. So it's long explanation.
Lots of points there, Alistair. Let me start with your first one about societies and marginalising and identifying the other and lumping them all together, both the domestic and the external ones. We've just had an excellent example of this, in my opinion, in Britain. Now, if you've been following the news, which I'm sure you all have, you would get the sense that the streets of Britain are blazing. I have been contacting people around the country, trying to find out whether this is so. And they all say that it's not. No doubt there are some events taking place in various towns and cities in Britain. But my sense is not on any particularly big scale. And if you actually go to the newspapers, look at the media coverage, you will notice one very interesting thing, which is that no one ever puts a number on the number of people who are supposed to be participating in these events that are taking place. And yet, we have endless stream of articles, commentaries, need to control social opinion, need to go after a certain American billionaire who is supposedly responsible for it. And of course, just recently, we've already had it all lumped together with the Russians. The Russians were behind it. There's apparently a site in Pakistan which is controlled by the Russians. Nobody ever produces any evidence for this, of course, which is supposed to be behind this. I am not sure whether anything on any particular scale has actually happened in Britain at all. Just saying, something has happened, but riots in Britain in August are not that unusual, as I'm sure Alistair knows. And yet, a whole narrative has been massively constructed around this event, and I'm not sure how much reality there is to any part of it. Just saying. And of course, all sorts of people have been identified and figured out and pointed to in this. Now, on the question of war in the Middle East,
can I just Can I just say something about that? I won't go into it because it's some difference beyond saying it. But again, it's the same thing about ideological alignment the cordon sanitaire. The far right cannot be allowed, or even the right, they're not far right, I mean, or even people. And what I think we are seeing, and in Europe, and I've felt for some time, is that when you see the graph of immigration arrivals rising and accelerating sharply, and at the same time you see the countergraph of standards of living, of people's standard and way of life declining, at the point that they intersect, you're going to have problems because, it affects their jobs and their standard of living. And you can see this. I see this here in Italy too. I mean, most Italians, many of them are having real difficulties, paying their gas bills and their electricity bills and things. And at the same time, immigrants are coming in that are being given, housing allowances, income, and all of these things. Not all of them, but when you see those graphs intersect like that, whatever you want to call it racism or whatever else you like, the fact is that there are deep problems in our Western societies, and all of this language that they use of far right thugs and racism and things like that is basically to sort of deflect from the fact of even admitting that there is a problem. You see some parts, England, I don't know so well. Some parts of them are already becoming decrepit. I mean, they're poor. I mean, and they're broken down. I mean, they call it the Rust Belt in the United States, but there are parts of Britain that are really, become grim and dirty and broken and things like this. I'm not suggesting this is solutions in these, but, at least address the fact that maybe this is a bit more than just, people, thugs going out on a night that it's just football hooliganism. I mean, just perhaps think maybe, they need to be aware that there can be deeper problems materializing. Anyway, you wanted to move on to Iran.
Well, indeed, my simple point was, as I said, people are being already labelled and targeted even before the events that you describe actually happen. Because as I said, I'm not convinced that anything particularly big actually has happened this August. That's just my point. Anyway, let's move on.
That's a fair point. So let's move on.
Yeah. Let's move on. Anyway, about Iran and about the war, I read, and I'm sure you probably know him, Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the US, wrote a piece in the Times of Israel. You might have read it. I find a most disturbing article altogether. First of all, it was going on and on about how, can Israel be sure that it's got America's got its back? What he really means by that is that, can we really be confident that America will be with us if we attack Iran? Because that was quite obviously what he wants. And the most extraordinary thing about the whole article was that he never at any place in it identified why Iran needed to be attacked at all. What exactly it was that Iran has done that justified the kind of war that he clearly wants to wage on it. Now, he comes across to me as a very sophisticated, highly educated man. He writes beautiful, clear English. But when you have that kind of mindset, and I don't know how influential he is, but I suspect he's fairly influential and fairly representative of thinking in the government in Israel. I have to say this. I think war is inevitable. It is clear that one side wants it. Now, they don't explain why exactly. It's not in this article. I didn't see that. And we've discussed the reasons in many other places. But one side clearly wants war. And going back to the point that you made about the events in April and the fact that the warning that was given then hasn't really been heeded. On the contrary, I think the Israelis are very frustrated about the fact that they were denied the opportunity in April to hit back hard on Iran. And I think that they want to escalate the situation. We have a situation in Washington that makes that almost possible. Netanyahu was there. He was applauded by Congress 58 times, as you pointed out, by the way, in a very fine article that you recently did. He is clearly aching for war. So are some of the people around him. I think when you have people who think in that way, war inevitably is going to come. The only thing that could stop it is if a government were to form in Washington, which was to say, absolutely not in any way, not at all. And I don't believe that's going to happen. I don't believe that's going to happen. Whoever wins in November, just saying, just for the reasons that you were saying before.
I don't think, and even if a government forms in November, I've said this before, they may be in office, but they won't necessarily be in power. Because, I've watched this over a period, all of this institutional America has sort of disaggregated into princedoms, small princedoms. There's the CIA princedom, the CENTCOM princedom, and they all have their own, the Treasury Department has its own foreign policy. The Homeland Security has its own foreign policy. I remember going to the Treasury about one thing some time ago about there being an executive order signed by a president, I think it was Trump at that stage, affected European companies. It was in the context of the Iranian negotiations and something. And I said, but, there's an executive order. The president has signed it. And they said, well, that may be the president's policy, but this is not the policy of the United States Treasury. Just like that. This is known as the interagency view in America. We saw that during that sort of impeachment of Trump, when I think it was Colonel Vindman said, yes, that may have been Trump's view, but it wasn't the interagency view. He was wrong. And of course, when he ordered the troops out of Syria, CENTCOM said, no, sorry, they stay. So, I mean, there's a major problem here of sort of managing the situation we're in that, whatever happens, if there is an election and there's someone in the White House, they can't commit whole of America, whole of society. They can't do that because the people who control what I call that sort of leveraged, structures that underlie it, the deep straits, long-term policies that have been around for, a long time and are untouchable. Whether you're a president or a presidential candidate, you cannot touch certain things. I mean, until that changes, I don't see that one can really, sort of see that. So it's not just a change in the government. I mean, the government is not particularly empowered to make those sort of changes. And it's going to require something more. I mean, let's not go there. It's too complicated discussion, that one. Let's stay on Iran. I just wanted to say a couple of things. Was that a friend of mine was in that guest house at the time Haniyeh was killed. He's from Hamas, but I've known him for years. I mean, so I know I've known him for my visits to Iran regularly and things like that. So I know him well. Now, he was sleeping in the same wing on the 4th floor, and Haniyeh was on the 2nd floor of this guest house. And what he said was that Haniyeh came back from the inauguration around about 11:30 at night. And then they sat around in the guest house, the Hamas sort of contingent with the aides of Haniyeh and so on, talking about the assassination of Shukr in Beirut and how that was going to play out and impinge on things until about 1:30 when they all went to bed, he to the fourth floor and Hania to the second floor. And then about 3:30 in the morning, there was this huge crash in the middle of the night. And this friend thought it was an earthquake. I mean, and he was sort of really worried that there was, the whole building was shaking and was thing. But he rushed down to the second floor to find mayhem. The outer wall had been completely demolished of the building. There was no outer wall. The bathroom, the ceiling, all of that had crashed in. He saw Hania dead. He was quite clearly dead. Went to look for the bodyguard and then found him also dead. And then brought in the guards, the authorities, into that case. So I think almost certainly it was a projectile that was fired actually into the building. I mean, he was there and was very firmly that is his view. And as I say, I've known him for years, and he was actually, just 2 floors up from Hania when this happened. So all that story that they're trying to peddle, that it was, some clever Mossad. Look, let's be straight about it. I have no evidence for this part whatsoever. But, it's not so difficult with Iran because there are 3,000 of the MEK that are still being trained by the US in Albania. They've been moved from Ashraf base now to Albania, and they are trained there. And these were the people that fought with Saddam Hussein against against Iran. They're bitter, extreme leftists, and they have their, I mean, it's impossible to have complete security in Iran against these people everywhere. These are the people that have been doing, on behalf of America and Israel, some of these assassinations of nuclear scientists and so on, because they're Iranian and they know how to move and come in. And they were originally, as I say, trained in Kurdistan, and then they were moved, I think, about 2003 to Albania or something, 2013. Now the Albanians are getting fed up with them. They've been taken off the terrorist list now for purposes one can guess at, but don't know. Anyway, I mean, I think my guess, it's just a guess, I have no substantive, but, these are the usual forces that can do these sort of operations and do them at quite short notice if asked to do it. So I don't think one can read too much into it. I mean, the Daily Telegraph article, and the same author then wrote that stupid piece about how there was a sort of great fight going on, but with the Revolutionary Guards, and that Pezeshkian was sort of fighting to have it done. He obviously, whoever wrote that, has no idea about how policy works in Iran. The president has domestic responsibility. He has the administration of domestic policy. And the foreign policy, is entirely in the hands of the Supreme Leader through the Supreme National Security Council. And the Pezeshkian will undoubtedly does sit on the Supreme National Security Council, but along with IRGC, the intelligence service, the foreign service, everyone who has an interest in these processes. And the ultimate decision, like the decision to attack Iran, was made by the Supreme Leader. And he has the last word on foreign policy. And the second thing is, Pezeshkian is close to and is admirer and is loyal to the Supreme Leader. And I mean, in any case, I mean, he wouldn't be able to, he has no prerogative to tell the Supreme, the Security Council. The Security Council is the policy-making body. No one else. There's not that sense that they tried to convey that there's a sort of government and it has a foreign policy and a domestic policy and all of this, and that he's sort of sitting there in charge and, the security policy people are answerable to him. All of that's nonsense. That's not how it works in Iran. So I was going to say, to your listeners and so on, the Daily Telegraph is a notorious purveyor both on Ukraine and on Iran of pure nonsensical propaganda. They should treat it with a long, long spoon.
To be besides which, would the Iranians?
Which you said, by the way.
Yes, would the Iranians ever talk to anybody in Iran, in government? Would they want to disclose this kind of information to the Daily Telegraph of all newspapers? Anyway, but putting all that aside, where are we going? I mean, there is going to be today. I mean, we had the swing a couple of days ago that the Iranians were rethinking and pulling back and all that. Now, today, yesterday, we're again full of alarm. Big attack from Iran is coming. What are the Israelis? What are the Americans going to do? Because I've heard it suggested that there is no simple answer to the question of the kind of missile attacks that you've been describing. By the way, what you described about the sequencing of attacks, I've been seeing this for some time in Ukraine. I mean, this is what the Russians do when they conduct missile attacks in Ukraine. And there is also a shortage of air defense missiles, which is something which I didn't know about until about a year ago, but it seems that there is. And this is a worldwide shortage, there is a Western-wide shortage of air defense missiles. So what are they going to do? I mean, are they going to try and launch an air campaign on Iran? I mean, this is the problem. Is there a military plan behind this war that appears to be coming? I sometimes get the sense, for example, that there clearly wasn't a military plan to speak of about the war in Ukraine, which they nonetheless provoked. But do they have a plan this time? How is it going to play out? What do they think is going to happen? And Israel itself, it seems to be going through many stresses and strains at the present time. The economy isn't too good. The military is said to be very unhappy. There was an article in the FT. I don't know whether this one is reliable, but apparently Netanyahu called his generals weaklings because they weren't leftists. So how do they conduct a war like this?
Actually, it's quite interesting because you have both the wars, the one that you follow so closely, the Ukraine war. I mean, it's really, in a sense, look what Zelensky's done. He has launched this sort of last hurrah raid into, through the sort of border forests into Russia. I am, by the way, with you in the sense that I think the Russians knew this was coming and were, pleased to see the stripping of the most experienced reserves from the Donbass and put into these, because, the Russians, are not quite clearly not panicked about this at all, but they can just take their time and they can eliminate it, slowly. It's not a great threat to Russia. And they just leave a great gaping hole in the Donbass. And so what do we get? We get the provocation. Drones are fired at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Oh my God, help me, come and help. West must come in and we've got to do something. And it's obvious that from the prisoners that have been taken in Kursk region, the Kursk nuclear power station was put down as one of their targets as well. So again, one of these sort of like a sort of child, wanting attention and wanting to sort of, why the West, you're not talking about us anymore, and, we need you to come in, and you've got to join in this war, and look, they're going to destroy a nuclear power station. And you've got Netanyahu more or less doing the same thing. I mean, going in, he didn't destroy a nuclear power station, but, well, let's wait and see what he has up his sleeve. But he goes in and he assassinates Hania in the most provocative way, just after he'd been embraced by the Pezeshkian, who, by the way, is very pro-Palestinian and very much a supporter of Hania. So there was a personal element to it as well. And so where do we, what happens next? This is what all the preparation has been going, why I think, and so I saw all as sort of arrogant things. There were little cartoons. Larry Johnson had one of a sort of yapping church, what you call those little dogs that yap a lot. Chihuahuas and the big, Israel sort of, they daren't, they've all been petrified by us and, they daren't. Well, the proof of the pudding will be when these missiles start flying in probably, I think, coordinated fashion between the various four axes here. And then what does Netanyahu do? Well, I think it'll be a little bit like Zelensky. I think there's a close symmetry. Okay, there's not the nuclear power plant to attack, but they have been hinting pretty obviously. I have no knowledge, I have no confirmation, but they have been talking. There was a long article that came out from one of the things saying, really now is the time, we've got to just drop a tactical bomb on Iran to let them know what's what and where they're going. I have no idea, but I mean, it's very hard to see. You keep saying what the plan is. Well, there is no plan B. I mean, Israel quite clearly doesn't have the means. I mean, all of the nuclear plant. I mean, 2 years ago, 2 years ago, Ehud Barak wrote an article, a long article, saying it's too late. Iran is already a threshold, nuclear threshold, not a weapons threshold state. And he said, we don't have the intelligence. We're unlikely to ever have the intelligence. It's almost impossible to know if they'd ever move to a weapons threshold, because you don't have to, you just do this deep underground in a small place. There's going to be almost no chance. This is the Prime Minister speaking, and former Defense Minister said, there's no chance that we, Israel, will be able to know whether that is happening or not. They're sober, so they can't destroy it. Their claims to we'll go over there and we'll knock out. Yeah, they can hit Natanz or something like this with conventional weaponry, but that will change nothing. There's enough enriched uranium anyway. So it won't. They can't change anything by that way. So then we get into the field of Armageddon and Gog and Magog, and I've mentioned before, when I think I spoke on your program before, about trying to see Israel as a sort of as an eschatological state, that we can't keep asking these questions rationally about Israel, because it is rational, but with a completely different epistemological base. The epistemological base is revelation and Torah and faith. It is not the sort of democratic process where Jews who are Democrats, if you like, there's a privatization of their Judaism. I mean, it becomes a sort of personal relationship with the Torah and with the Talmud and things like that. subject to what the rabbis tell them and so on. But, what they're looking at is something quite different, which is going back to a form of Judaism, which is about revelation, about trust in God's promise to the Jewish people, and that you don't question this, and that you are, a real foot soldier. And this is why what's happening in Israel now is so significant, is that you have these many rabbis, there are about 100 that support this man, Dov Lior, who's the sort of main rabbi for the Jewish underground and for the settlers. And these are the ones that, give the legitimacy to soldiers killing and torturing, killing in schools and hospitals and so on. And they do that basically under the base of the sort of Babylonian Talmud. They have the right to, they have the ability to do this. But so you're getting into this crisis between, if you like, democratic Zionism and fundamental Zionism. And there are 700,000 settlers in the hills who now call themselves the state of Judea, at war with the state of Israel. And people like Smotrich and Ben Gavir can call down this army of vigilantes if they disagree with what the army is doing and what it's saying. So where are they taking this? I mean, I think they will be looking for provocation that the United States cannot ignore or won't ignore, because the United States has these deep structures of support for Zionism across all of its institutional leadership cadre in the US. So how do they not support it? So what sort of provocation after the killing of Shukr and Haniyeh? I mean, what's next? I don't know. But you say to me, what can they do? I mean, this seems to me the sort of direction of travel that we're on, rather than the sort of rational sort of, go to war with Iran in this way and troops and tanks and things. Forget all that. I don't think it's that at all. So that's where I think we're at. Unpredictable, and is it inevitable? Yes, and maybe we're talking about all of region war, Russia involved as well, because the West is escalating. I mean, it's really, for me, quite striking that you hear the spokesperson of the EU and of the US saying, effectively, look, we don't rule out sort of attacking Moscow.
This is, I think, one of the sources of the irrationality, as you said, is because I think they recognize there's not any war solutions, but they also have ruled out peaceful solutions implicitly, I think, because once what you started to talk about was this idea we talk about the political identities being diametrical opposite, but what's fascinating is we never, in the media or politicians, they never ever talk about competing security interests anymore. I never turned on the news and heard about Iranian security concerns or Russian security concerns, or ours for that sake. It's always this competing ideological identities. So whenever we deal with problems from Hamas to Iran, it's always, how do we stop them, which is either a deterrence or defeating them, but I guess never reassuring and seeking to accommodate their security concerns, which is why we end up with this sloganeering. I would say, as you spoke of earlier, Alexander, this also addressed to some extent with the riots in Britain as well. We at no point do we want to ask, well, what are their concerns? As Alastair suggested, economic problems work. Instead, it's just these labels, if they're hateful, thugs, weird, or whatever they would be. So anyways, my point is never do we explore any peaceful solutions. And even when we do talk about peace, it's usually the idea of buying time to fight later. Even Ukraine, even if we see territory, okay, but at least they have to be part of NATO, so we can take this fight another day. And it seems it's the same with Iran. Even if I don't understand. Even if the Israelis are able to pull in the Americans, what can actually be achieved in a war with Iran? Because it seems, for example, nuclear weapons, they can build a bomb if they would want to, and the best way to make them want to is to bomb Iran. So I'm just curious what could actually be achieved, even if they get America. So
what they can achieve in Iran is highly important to those deep structures. It is that they can control China's energy flow, because if they can control the energy flow from Iran and to an extent from Russia, China has no energy resources, and therefore you can contain it, you can shrink it, you can create disturbances as the economic system deteriorates because of lack of more expensive oil. China is wholly dependent, very much dependent on oil from Iran and Iraq. In the sense that Iran is more important because Iraq is still under American control. And so, it's been a long ambition of those structures to be able to, they can't, and it's already obvious, they can't control China by, putting sanctions on chips. It's not working. It's just not functioning. The Chinese are just doing it anyway. And actually what it's doing is it's putting up the expenditure. I wrote a piece about it. It's putting up the cost of the Western companies in the tech companies and making them less competitive internationally. It's an own goal effect in many ways. And so the one way in which you can cut China down to size, other than by a war, which I think America knows it doesn't have the manufacturing capacity to wage at the moment. It just doesn't have. This is something you've talked about, Alexander. I know some lengths. They just don't have that capacity. But Iran off the map, or Iran under American control, regime change in Iran, then China can be switched off its energy supplies. So that's one. I'm not saying that is. I'm not being prescriptive. I'm just saying one has to think about how Russia and China will be looking at what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, and Russia particularly will be looking how it affects them, and it affects China, and it affects the whole BRICS. In a sense, because we're going back to this whole issue. The West, all our wealth was about drawing in the wealth from India and from around the world, and the oil and the energy supplies. And that was at the base of our pyramid of wealth that I described earlier. And then we had a pyramid, but it had a real base at the bottom, real wealth coming from, not from us, but from the Middle East and from India and other places. And now, all the juice has been sucked out of the Western economies by the sort of financialized capitalism that it pursues. So, there's only service industries basically sort of really left, and there's nothing solid. So they at some point need to reset this if they're going to survive in the longer term. Are those people, I suspect they're in the control room. I know they're in the control room. Some of these people from the banks and from the big banks in New York and things, together with the Hollywood and the Silicon Valley people. I guess it must be, a reasonably sized control room that is running things. But of course, we'll never be told who's actually in that control room. But there is this argument going on in Wall Street as well as Silicon Valley that the West cannot. It's structurally impossible to go on spending as it has been spending now without some sort of great change that will reliquefy the whole of the Western system. So this is part of the thing. And yes, in the short term and tactically, it may not be very suitable, but it's always been not a bad thing to be a war candidate, a war president in the United States. If you haven't got a good economic program agenda to present, you can always try and do that. And who knows, all right, today we have Kamala Harris. If they wanted to change it, it looks probably change it, before November anyway, and have a sort of a war candidate put in there instead. Maybe that was what was being planned with, the Republican, because these are uniparty things with the Republican Milwaukee. I mean, Trump wasn't supposed to arrive. I think he did. He turned his head at the wrong moment anyway, and he arrived. Otherwise, we'd have probably Nikki Haley as candidate and Pence as vice candidate. Maybe that would have been, and I'm only sort of talking totally sort of freewheeling, but, maybe this was sort of a scenario that one could envisage too. Anyway, it didn't happen. He was stopped and it didn't happen. And Trump and Vance are the team going forward, if they get that. But on the Democratic side, if they can change it so quickly and sort of, provide the sort of, the acclaim for a new candidate without, touching a voting system, I mean, they can always do it again. But I'm not saying that, and I'm not suggesting it. I'm just saying we're in a time of huge uncertainty. And there are these sort of pressures for war that are coming from Netanyahu, and also the pressures for war in Ukraine that are coming from a different quarter. But I mean, we shouldn't underestimate those. I mean, look what we saw with Belasov. It's pretty clear that what he warned the Americans from, you probably heard more, but when he spoke to the U.S. Defense Secretary, was a planned assassination against Putin and the leadership during that naval celebration in St. Petersburg. And he said, "You know about this. You better pull the leash hard on your people there." So, I mean, it's both, all of these things are sort of, I don't want to paint a gloomy picture because I'm not actually gloomy at all, because I feel change is inevitable and we're on the cusp of big changes. It's not going to be pleasant and everything, but we're at an inflection point. And this is how change happens. It's not abnormal, but we're going through an intense period of change at the moment. So, everything that we can see 6 months hence will look completely different, will be completely different. That will be my prediction. Whatever we see today, 6 months hence, it'll be quite different.
But it seems things can't continue like this anyways, because I very much agree with this idea that the system has to be, reliquefied, as you said, that it's running dry. But it seems every effort to do so, it has the opposite effect. So, for example, the sanctions on Russia, breaking Russia could have been a good way of rebooting the system. But instead, we saw that the Russians could diversify their economic connectivity to the East. The Europeans could not. And now, as you mentioned, the same with the Chinese. With the Americans trying to break their chip industry, the Chinese were able to pursue self-sufficiency and diversify, while the Americans lost, especially Intel, their most important client. So they cut 15,000 jobs, and now you see they're going from bad to worse. So it does it does seem that it's not. With every effort, things go from bad to worse. It's counterproductive. One just begs the question: when do we stop doubling down and instead absorb these losses and try something different?
The problem that won't happen because these structural things. How do you change the the financialized structure of the United States. I mean, even if you had an empowered president who was capable of doing it, how would you set about, you have to change the whole economic structure. I mean, the corporations, the structures, the financial, the banking system, everything is geared to one, a hyper financialized consumer economy. How do you, now, I mean, Russia is changing it and has changed it in 10 years in a way, and moved towards the real economy, and changed its whole basis away towards the sort of sense of sort of saying the prime responsibility of an economy is to provide employment sufficient so that your people can afford to buy a house, can afford medical assistance, can go to school, and can live normal lives, and that you have a responsibility for the welfare of the community, not a responsibility for the welfare of oligarchs and corporations. I mean, you have to have a strategic view about how to manage a real economy. Yes, and Russia has that too. But you have also got to sort of ground it in the fact that you have to, and it was Friedrich List, I mean, in the 19th century, who kept predicting against Adam Smith, and he said, if you move to more and more a debt-based consumer society, after a while you'll get to the point where you're unable to provide employment for your people. There will not be the means for people to have the full employment if you sort of financialize the whole economy and move away from, a real economy. Then ultimately, you will have the problem that there is not the ability there to give people employment and a life. And so, I mean, he saw this danger long ago. So did Count Witte, who was the prime minister of Tsarist Russia at the time.
What do you say to the view, which is one that we've discussed with Professor John Mearsheimer on programs that we've done, that in order for there to be a real fundamental change in American and Western policy, that the only thing that can really do it is the shock of a major military defeat, an absolute military debacle. It could be in Ukraine, it could be in the Middle East, but that might be the final shock in the system that finally causes a rethink.
I quite agree. I call it something slightly different. I just call it catharsis. We have to go through this process. We have become so dysfunctional. I mean, look, wherever you look in Europe, things just don't function very well. Problems don't get resolved. Things just deteriorate and deteriorate. We've become so dysfunctional. We have become so morally bankrupt, and we've become so decrepit in many respects as civilization. I don't want to bring in sort of controversial things, but I think the recent Olympics underlined that pretty clearly. I mean, to the rest of the world, they just look at that and sort of think, "Oh my God, they've gone crazy." And I think therefore catharsis comes. Now the question is, from my point of view, is not whether catharsis is going to come, but is there anyone going to be able to manage it so that catharsis is only painful sufficiently to finish the job of bringing about a transformation, or are we going to see it slip into something which is going to result in a huge suffering and catastrophe for millions of human beings? And I don't know which it will be. I hope it will be the former. Thank God we've got a few sane people in the world, like Putin and like Xi and the supreme leader, who actually realize these dangers. I mean, whether people in your audience listening think that this is a terrible thing to say, that these people are sane and have arts. But I've sat with Putin for hours, and I find him always thinking long term, always thinking in these terms, but strategy. Z is the same. And in Iran are notorious. I mean, this is why they take so long doing anything, because they're always thinking things through. And I keep having to tell, when I speak to my Iranian friends, I say to them, stop being so wretchedly rational. Can't you understand that the West works on emotion more than reason? So don't sort of calculate us all in your rational way, because the Iranians are so rational. But I think, yes, the question is, are we going to find a break in this catharsis that stops it slipping into the abyss? Let's hope so. But I think catharsis is inevitable. And I think Mearsheimer is right with that. Now, I do disagree with Mearsheimer on one point, is he's very much a realist. And I don't mind the realism. I mean, I agree with realism in a sense, but I think he undervalues the ability of human agency, and also that societies and whole civilization can have a change of psyche. That it is possible. I think he sees these things much in terms of GDP on the one hand, and military strength and economic strength, and this is the things that determine these outcomes. And I think there is human agency. I mean, look at what Putin has done during this period since Yeltsin. I mean, I think it's undeniable that he has, pulled Russia. Whether Westerners like it or not is irrelevant. Russians like it. He's pulled Russia out of the doldrums, which is an extraordinary thing. And much of it was his personal human agency that's done it. And so I think there's human agency, and I think also one can almost feel there's a change in psyche globally. I mean, it's not a very pleasant one for the West, because the psyche of globally is that they just think so little of us now, and they think we are, spent force. And what is more, they are turning increasingly to the view that we should just be ignored or set aside. And maybe we've deserved it, that's all.
Well, it's interesting with what you say about political realism, because back in the days, Kenneth Waltz, he made the argument that was not a foreign policy theory, simply because, well, as you suggested, it's based on the principle of rationality. But if the states aren't acting rational, then the physical laws of political realism no longer applies. And I think that also goes into what you argued about, why things don't also get fixed, because the political discourse as well has been so it's been so terrible. For example, in your article, you pointed out this with Kamala Harris, when she was some pressure for course correction. People are screaming about the genocide in Palestine. All she has to do is say, listen, if you want Trump to win, continue to talk, otherwise shut up. And then people are quiet and they applaud. And how can you really fix any trouble, even be opposed to genocide once things reach that polarization? And it's not even, of course, it's problematic that oligarchs can choose their candidate the way they disposed of Biden. But what's even more shocking is the way public opinion can now be manipulated to the irrational as well. So, this excitement they try to create with Kamala Harris after ignoring her for 4 years, and bringing a no one like Tim Walz in, and now everyone should be excited about him. It's like they're pressing buttons, and people buy into all the nonsense. Under these circumstances, one has to beg the question whether or not society and states are even rational anymore, in which they're not. I would agree that a lot of the premise of political realism seems to go away.
Well, I think this is, these are the issues that are not being discussed in the West, that are at the subject of this complex debate taking place in Iran, between Iran and Russia, and between Russia and China, and between Russia with many different actors. acting as a sort of center for this whole process, both in the region and beyond. And sadly, the Europeans are just, instead of turning their attention to asking for restraint from Israel, can only just simply turn and beg Iran that it needs to be restrained, even after it did restrain itself and was then immediately provoked again by Israel. But no, it's, this is, so no rationality in this. This is all about something going far beyond it. I mean, we're going, into a politics. I kept trying to explain, eschatological politics has completely different epistemology. It's about the Bible, it's about revelation, about law and Torah and faith and things like those. And, we go on looking at it through enlightenment, rationality, which is secular. And so it's not surprising we just can't understand it, and therefore we find it threatening, and we find it as something that we can not manage, except with Israel, because Israel is deeply, in many ways, Israel is the United States, and the United States is Israel in a very complicated way. About seeing it and about how they react to it and everything else. So, it's so important because there are so many of those structures that depend, whose rationale, whose survival depends on Israel surviving as a state.
Well, one very last point from me, that you were talking about how most of the rest of the world is giving up on us. In fact, I'd say pretty much all the world. Look at the reactions of the African countries to the latest thing that the Ukrainians have been saying. It's how a Ukrainian government would do such a thing, how Western governments would allow a Ukrainian government to do such a thing is just beyond belief. But a much more important country, a very powerful country, a rising country, Indonesia, likely to become a major part of the world economy, a major player in the future. It's had elections recently. Its new president chose. He's not yet president. He's president-elect. He chose to visit Moscow. If you read the things that he said whilst he was in Moscow, he talks about the country as his friend. He talks about the times when Indonesia and the Soviet Union were very close in the 1960s. He's clearly charting a course that is going to take Indonesia in a completely different direction from the one the West would like. And what makes it interesting is that this is a former close associate, apparently, within the military of ex-President Suharto, whom I'm sure you all remember. So, this is, this enormous shift that's taking place around the world, and people in the West are not aware of it, at all. I never read articles in the British media about Indonesia anymore. People are not interested in what it's doing or what it's thinking or what its new president is all about.
Yeah. Exactly. I opened sort of Politico this morning, and they have this sort of high school sort of language that they use, which is supposed to be jokey and clever and cool, and they're sort of saying, well, let's the one thing there was one item on the foreign policy agenda about securing the nuclear power stations, and then saying, so now we can all get back to concentrating on the American election and how Kamala Harris is doing in the polls, and she's coming up and closing the gap in the swing states. And clearly, they don't want to know what's going on in the rest of the world at all. So, unfortunately, this is a lonely job, trying to talk about foreign policy, I think, except people listen in other parts of the world, I'm sure.
Okay, with that, we went a bit over time, so I suggest we wrap it up, unless there's any final comments. No? Okay, excellent. Well, thanks again, Alastair Crooke, very much for your time. And
thank you. Thank you.
Sensible return.
Thank you very much for hosting the program. Thank you.